received instructions from President Eisenhower and from Secretary Dulles before you left for Vietnam. Why did they think an American presence was necessary there? And what were their assessments of your chances for success?
Well, actually, we had an American presence in Vietnam, an ambassador there, Ambassador Heath, Donald Heath. But Heath's tour was about up, and he was due to be relieved, and Ambassador Harrington, who was our representative in Hong Kong, had not yet reported into duty there. And President Eisenhower knew that I had visited Vietnam on a couple of occasions. As a matter of fact, I'd gone down there first in 1933. I was stationed in the Philippines at that time and had an opportunity to go up purely as a sightseer. I went up very largely to see the great ruins at Angkor in Cambodia. But I'd traveled up through the area where much of the fighting later on occurred, particularly through the rubber plantation. And then in about 1951, as I recall rightly, Marshal de Lattre, who was the French commander in Vietnam, invited me down to Vietnam to take a look-see, I think very largely in order that our government could have a better understanding of the problems that the French were running into. So I met Marshal de Lattre in Saigon, flew up with him to, and incidentally, young John Kennedy rode on that plane. He was a young congressman from at that time.
But did Dulles and Eisenhower discuss with you a little bit of the history of why we were there and how Vietnam figured in our stance against communism? That's what I meant, really.
Oh, I see. Yes. Yes, they did. And Dulles particularly felt that our chances of success, that is, our chances of reinforcing the French and preventing the takeover of Vietnam by the communists, wasn't better than about 50-50, as a matter of fact.
Did he say why?
Well, because the French had just been defeated at Bien Bien Phu. The communists had the French on the run from a military standpoint. After the defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the French had asked us for help, and we had said no, we couldn't do anything then. But later, as the condition got worse in Vietnam, and it was quite apparent that the French were not going to be able to hold off the communists, then they decided to ask for help from the United States, both military help and military aid from a monetary standpoint.
Did you get any sense from Dulles of that particular intensity that he had felt about fighting communism and holding the line in South Vietnam? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Of course, Mr. Dulles was a strong anti-communist, and he felt that we had to draw a line somewhere to stop the communists. And out in the Pacific, it would involve Vietnam. And so he emphasized that point, that we would have to do our best. And this is one of the reasons to stop communism. And this is one of the reasons, I imagine, that they wanted to have a military man go down there to try to reinforce and reorganize the local Vietnamese army and to strengthen the French temporarily, but only temporarily.
Then what was to happen if this was only a temporary assignment?
Well, I was to develop a program then for aid to Vietnam, not solely military aid, because we already had a very competent man down there, military man, in Mike O'Daniel, old Iron Mike. And no, they wanted someone who had some experience in international affairs and who might draw up a program of military and economic aid that would reinforce the local government of Ziem.
Right. Could you tell us the story of your arrival in Saigon and who wasn't there?
Yes.
And why?
Well, I had been associated with the commanding general of the French forces down there as a member of the standing group of NATO. After I retired as Chief of Staff of the Army, General Eisenhower had asked me to stay on active duty as a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization standing group. And my opposite number in the French was General Paul Elie. So I had gotten to know Elie and had a good deal of admiration for him, and we had a very friendly basis. When I arrived in Saigon, my first intimation that the French were not too enthusiastic about my coming was that Paul Elie was not there at the airport to help greet me, which in French courtesy conditions would have been the thing to do. So I realized then that the French were not going to be too enthusiastic. Elie had gone up to Dalat, D-A-L-A-T, Dalat up in the mountains, which was the summer capital of Vietnam at that time. But rather than take affront at that, since I was going to have to get along with Elie, and we had gotten along well as members of the standing group, I decided to go up and visit Dalat. So the first thing I did was to fly up there, called on Paul, and he began to melt a little bit after I explained my mission. And thereafter, we got along handsomely together.
Why was he and why were the French unhappy about your mission?
Because they wanted to still retain a French présence, as they called it, in Vietnam. In other words, they still wanted, in the backs of their minds and hearts, they still wanted to have French France as a major ally, you might say, and guide to the Ziem government.
What were their views of the communists and a possible communist takeover? I mean, did they have a different attitude about holding the line than we Americans did?
No, I don't think so. They were very much interested in preventing the takeover, and the only persons that could, or the only nation that could take over, would be the communists, not nation, but a group, would be the communists and
Vietnam?
Beg pardon?
Let's cut for a minute.
Yeah.
Rest. Do you want to have a sip of water?
Yeah.
Could you tell us the story of your meeting with Dulles?
I reported to Mr. Dulles and was met by a number of men from the State Department and one or two from the Department of Defense also. Mr. Dulles emphasized the fact that, in his judgment, the communists would take over unless the United States came to the aid of the French, both economically and to a certain extent from a military point of view. He said that he thought the chances of our success would be not greater than about 50%, but that he thought it was worthwhile, because Mr. Dulles was strongly anti-communist, and he was trying to build up a wall around the world, actually, to hold back the advance of communism. And this was part of that program.
Excellent. Next one was, you arrived at the airport. Elie didn't meet you. We've heard that. What were your impressions of the political situation in that country when you arrived?
Well, when I arrived in Saigon, it was chaotic. There's no question about that. The very day that I arrived, the Chief of Staff of the Vietnamese Army, Hin, H-I-N-H, was inveighing against Diem and his presence there over a radio that was supported, as a matter of fact, by U.S. aid. Well, I put a stop to that right off the bat, I can assure you. I got to know Hin later on, and I thought one of the first things that I ought to do was to make clear to General Heen that I was going to support Mr. Diem, which was one of the major points of my instructions from General Eisenhower and Mr. Dulles. And Heen said that he was going to stay on. He hinted that he would start a rebellion. I assured him that if he did that, then all military aid to Vietnam would cease. And so finally, by putting pressure on Heen, I got him to leave town in about a week. And as a matter of fact, he never returned again. He came back once, part way, but he never got back into Vietnam.
I guess you made quite an impression on him.
That's the end of the roll.
Okay, got to change. What was your assessment of what Diem was faced with when you arrived?
Well, he was faced with a mountain of problems. First of all, he was a Roman Catholic, and a very devout one, in a Buddhist country, which was a mark against him right off. He was really from the north central part of the country, whereas Saigon and the political rulers of the country were down in the south. So they had that against him also. In addition, he didn't have any great political skill. Maybe we could touch on that perhaps a little later. But he was also faced with the opposition from 3 organized groups in South Vietnam. First, the Cao Dai. These names are fascinating to me. The Cao Dai was basically a sect that had control over a large part of the farming country of the rice-producing area of South Vietnam. They had their own little army, which the French had supported on the side, which was not pro-Diem. In addition, there was another group known as the Cao Dai. No,
Let's cut.
did I say Cao Dai first?
Yeah, you said.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Tell me about these sects that were lined up against Diem.
There were 3 of these groupings, all very powerful, each with its own private army. First, the Cao Dai. I think these names are fascinating to me. The Cao Dai were a Buddhist group who controlled a great deal of the best farmland in old Cochin China. They had their own private army, which was supported privately on the side by the French, strongly anti-Diem. The next group was the Wahao, another wonderful name. They were headed by a man by the name of Huang, and they had their own private army and controlled another section of the farmland down in South Cochin China. The third group was another interesting one called the Bin Suyen, Binhxuyen, headed by a guy that would have made his way very nicely in the Chicago underworld of that time. Bai Vien was his name. He controlled the secret police, mind you, of Vietnam. He also controlled all the houses of prostitution and the gambling joints in Cholan, the suburb of Saigon. And this was the source of his strength, the money end of it. These 3 groups were tolerated by the French, and as I say, were supported to a certain extent on the side. None of them was very enthusiastic about having this Catholic, pure man as head of the government, you see. So they all constantly threw up opposition against him.
That's excellent. Can you talk a little bit now about the other group that was a problem for Diem, which was the communists in the countryside? What was your assessment of their strength and the quality of their organization?
Well, of course, they had proven their strength by defeating the French army.
Can you start over and say, well, the communists had proven their strength?
Oh, the communists, of course, had proven their strength by defeating the French at, oh goodness,
Dien Bien Phu. You can
Dien
start
Bien
it
Phu.
over again.
Yeah. Well, of course, the communists had proven their strength by defeating the French army at Dien Bien Phu, a short time before the French finally asked for help. As a matter of fact, at that time, I was a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. No, I had just left the JCS. They had asked for very strong help on the ground. General Ridgway sent, who was my successor as Chief of Staff of the Army, sent a party over to Vietnam to survey the situation and recommended against it. And had I been on active duty, I also would have recommended against the idea of putting American troops on the ground in Vietnam. This was a different story from Korea. See, and a lot of people have this confused. In Korea, we went in under the aegis of the United Nations. Had we gone into Vietnam at that time, we would have done it, as we later did, on our own. And this made a vast difference in the general attitude of the Congress and of the American people.
I agree. But let's go back to the communists in the countryside. When you arrived in Vietnam, what was your assessment of their strength?
Well, they were very strong. They controlled most of the roads, for example, that led from the north down into Saigon. You had to be very careful and had to have protection, and the French to travel around in the countryside. The French had put up a series of outposts along the main highways, and there were constant sabotage against them and hijacking of people that were traveling north and south. So it had to be done with a military escort. Of course, I flew most of the time from Saigon. When I went up to see General Lee in Dalat, I flew there. But I also traveled a good many of the roads at various times. But the communists dominated the countryside, particularly to the north of Saigon. They had practically full control. Not exactly, but de facto control of the countryside.
When we talked before, you told me a little bit about your sense of their organization and how they worked. Could you expand on that a bit? Sort of start again by saying that they controlled a lot of land, but why? I mean, why were they so strong at this point?
Well, the communists had wormed their way into control of the South, not entirely against the wishes of the countryside people, because they had opposed the French. The French didn't always use the best judgment in handling the local people, and the communists felt that they could do better and had persuaded the farmers, for example, and the people on the countryside that they could get more from a government not controlled by the French, even though it was controlled by the communists. And so basically a goodly portion of the people in the countryside they were not so much pro-communist as they were anti-French and anti-Diem after Diem took control.
Very good. What were your first impressions of President Diem when you first met him? What do you remember, what did he look like and how did he strike
Right.
you?
Well, of course, as soon as I arrived in Saigon, I called on President Diem. He spells it D-I-E-M, but it's pronounced Z-I-E-M. He met me, as he often did later on, at the head of some marble steps that led up from the entrance to the Norodom Palace, which he had taken over. And as I looked up the stairway there, here was this short, pudgy little man, not at all impressive in appearance, but very polite and very solicitous of greeting me in a friendly fashion, because he knew that I was coming over to help him to establish a government there. My impression of him was that, even at this moment, was that he was not a man of great strength, quite a good deal of personal charm, but he didn't impress me even then as a man who would be strong as he later proved to be. And of course, I had no idea how competent he was at that time.
Most people that we talk to, whatever complaints they have about ZM, have a certain amount of personal affection for him.
I came to know him and to develop a personal affection for him in a mild way. He was, in my judgment, a completely honest, dedicated patriot, given to trying to help his country as best he could. And so I always had a personal touch of affection for him. I got to know him very well. I saw him frequently. And I always found him quite direct in his dealings with me. But there was always in the back that he didn't agree with what we were trying to do. But we got along very well on a personal basis.
Did you sense the influence of his brother and his brother's wife? Can you talk a little bit about this
Right.
family?
We get
What a
drink
cut.
a bit of water here.
Yeah.
Just a moment.
Okay. Did you have any difficulties in dealing with ZM and in getting him to take action?
Had a great deal of difficulty getting him to take action. He was an Oriental after all, and the Orientals are pretty devious in what they do in promising as compared to what they do in action. And furthermore, ZM was a very shy man, naturally. He was a Mandarin, really above the level of the average farmer, for example, in the countryside. It was difficult for him to get down to their level. I did persuade him to take one trip out of Saigon to go back up to his home province. And it was a great success, and he came back enthusiastic about it. But I could never get him to go back again. He was just shy, and he didn't have the natural political know-how as to how to get out and meet people. It just wasn't in him. His brother was a different story. His brother knew.
Start over and say his brother knew.
His brother knew.
Sorry, I'm changing frame size.
His brother knew, and knew his vixenous wife, who really were the powers behind the throne, behind ZM.
What were your conclusions? What was your assessment of ZM's abilities as an administrator?
Well, while I liked the man and had a great admiration for his personal honesty, I soon came to be convinced that he lacked administrative ability. He simply, first of all, he was a Mandarin. He couldn't get out and at the level of the people of the countryside. That was beneath his tradition as a Mandarin of the old school. The second thing was that he was dependent too much on his family. He had 5 brothers all told, but the most important one was Brother New. And this man and his wife, who was a vixen of the first order, they came to dominate ZM in almost every political sense, at any rate. Behind the scenes only. You never saw his brothers in public to amount to anything. At least I didn't. The Vietnamese did, because his Mu's wife organized a women's support for ZM, and she was very active political and very skillful also. ZM himself didn't have that kind of skill. He was a fine man personally, but he lacked administrative ability. And that was one of his basic faults. One of the major aspects of that was his inability to delegate authority to anybody, that is, to anybody that had ability. Because, frankly, what Brother New and the ZM family were endeavoring to do, I became convinced, was to set up a ZM dynasty or a Nyo dynasty as a replacement of the Baodai dynasty of the past. This was their real objective. I'm convinced that ZM's objective was the improvement of his country, improvement of the conditions of life of the people, improving of the financial and other conditions. But this was not the case, in my judgment, for the Nyo family. They were out primarily for the benefit of the Nyo family, the traditional business of having a family dominate the political aspects of the country. So I could never get him to broaden his government, which was one of Mr. Dulles' admonitions to me when I first went out there, was to try to get the government to be more representative of the people. I could never get ZM to take in anybody of real ability to assist in the organization of the government, or to organize a modern type of an assembly to guide him. Later on, I did develop a 7-point program for the improvement of the government, which covered all aspects of my mission, not solely the military aspects of it. Cut for a minute. Now, would you want me to go into this?
How did the presence of a lot of Catholic refugees from the North affect the situation in the South?
Well, of course, it's important to understand that when the Geneva Accords were made, an agreement was made with France to divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel. And anyone north of the parallel was permitted to move south, and vice versa. Anyone south of the parallel could move north if they chose. About 900,000 Catholics, under their village Catholic priests, moved from north to south. There was only a handful of people that moved from south to north to get away from the ZM government. These refugees, as I say, came down under their parish priests. They were settled by parishes in areas that were prepared for them by the South Vietnamese government. But they remained as Catholic enclaves in a Buddhist country, and very much as the Southerners, following our Civil War, objected to the carpetbaggers that came from the North and took over a good many of the political posts in the South, so also the South Vietnamese Buddhists strongly objected to this Catholic groupings of the ZM adherents who came south. They were never really assimilated into the people of the South. They never had any part in the government later on. They became foreigners so far as the Southerners were concerned. And this affected the general support of the countryside for the ZM government. It was referred to as a Catholic government, for example. And this was reinforced by the visits of Cardinal Spellman, who came over to visit Vietnam during my time there. And when he arrived, banners were put up in the streets hailing this archbishop, or this cardinal, hailing the Catholic Church with the colors of the cardinal. And this didn't sit very well with the Buddhists either, of course. In addition, after Spellman had been there were two different high-ranking Catholic prelates who came up at the invitation, probably, of ZM, although I don't know that this was the case. And each time we had the same hubbub about a Catholic government, which the Buddhists in Vietnam never agreed. I finally decided to ask, I don't recall whether I contacted Cardinal Spellman, whom I knew personally, or whether I persuaded Diem not to invite any more Catholic prelates there, because politically it was not an asset, it was a counter asset to the Diem government. His government became known to the opponents as a Catholic government, which didn't sit very well with the Buddhists.
Very good answer. You eventually concluded that Diem wasn't going to make it, and you reported this to Washington. How was your report received in Washington, and in particular, what was Senator Mansfield's reaction?
Well, after I had developed a program to assist the Diem government in a very broad way, not solely in a military way, which Diem never really tried to implement, I became convinced, well, that fact, plus the fact that I was never able to persuade him to bring into the government anybody of real ability, that he would never be able really to create a government that would be truly representative of his adherents in the South. And much to my regret, I finally had to report to Washington gradually that I was becoming convinced that Diem didn't have the political skills, nor did he have the personality to really manage a government in Vietnam. And I so reported to Washington. As a result of that, the adherents of Diem in Washington, particularly in the Congress, Senator Mansfield, who at that time I think was head of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, Mrs. Green, who was a very powerful force in the House, and one or two others, mostly Catholics, with that slant, began to develop a backfire against any thought of removing Diem. I hadn't suggested at that time that we give up on Diem, but I did point out to Washington that I was becoming convinced that Diem would not make the grade. Later on, after I came back to Washington and discussed the situation here with members of the State Department and some of the congressmen also, and probably with Senator Mansfield, although I don't recall that for certain. I then went back to Saigon.
Hold on, we're out of film.
The last
What were your conclusions about Diem, and how was your report received in Washington?
Well, my final conclusion, after much thought and much, I must say, heart-wringing, frankly, become, I liked Diem, but I became convinced that he did not have the political knack nor the strength of character politically to manage this bizarre collection of people in Vietnam. I could never get him to broaden his government, which was one of the chief objectives that I had received from Mr. Dulles. He wouldn't take in anybody who had real ability. And the reason was not so much Diem himself as it was these two people behind the throne who really managed the country, Brother New and his wife, Madame New. They wanted to build up a new government, frankly. And so I could never get Diem to broaden the government as he should have if it was going to be a success. When I finally became convinced of that, I really then had to come to a decision as to whether I was going to recommend continued support for Mr. Diem or not. This was brought to a head by the fact that Paulie Lee had said that no longer could he support Diem. He had only supported Diem half-heartedly anyhow. So I finally had to report to Washington that rather than waste additional money in supporting an army for ZM and giving continued economic aid, that we would finally have to decide whether we were going to do that or whether we were going to try some alternative. And I finally recommended that unless ZM could broaden his government, could show some political acumen to manage the country, then we ought to finally withdraw our support. This was vigorously opposed by Senator Mansfield, by Senator Kennedy, and by Mrs. Kelly in the House, who was another Catholic. There was this little Catholic group. I happened to be a Catholic. But nevertheless, I became convinced that there was too great an influence in Vietnam of Diem and his Catholicism, that this was mitigating against his ability to keep contact with the people and to establish leadership for the people as a whole. And I so finally had a report to the Congress.
Cut.
Turning.
What was Lansdale's relation to and influence on ZM, and what was your relationship with Lansdale?
Well, he had considerable influence with ZM, Lansdale did. He was out there without really, as far as I can recall, without any official government position from the State Department, at least. But he did have considerable influence on ZM. He had stayed with ZM during a good deal of the time when he was out there. He also had considerable influence with Brother New, because he was convinced that ZM did have the ability, which I became convinced ZM did not have. So, as far as I know, Lansdale was giving one set of advice to his representatives in the State Department, who was Allen Dulles, who probably was responsible for his going out there. Allen Dulles, you may recall, at that time was head of the CIA. And while Lansdale never officially admitted that, de facto he was a CIA man, as far as I know, out there at the time. The point came finally when I had to make clear to Lansdale that I was the ambassador there, and this is one of the things that Ike emphasized to me when he read my instructions. He said, "Joe, this is the best set of instructions that I've ever read that was given to an ambassador, because you are in charge of all aspects of the embassy." And this is where Lansdale and I parted company. According to Lansdale, he finally one day up and left at that. I don't recall that, and I've never been able to confirm that. I assure you that had he left, he would never have come back again. This might have put me in opposition to some of the people here in Washington, but it never occurred.
Okay.
Now, the other man that had a good deal of influence with ZM was from Michigan State University, Mr. Wesley Fischel.
Can we start that over?
Yeah. Start that over. So
Yeah.
that you-
The other man who, aside from the government representatives, who had a good deal of influence on Mr. ZM and his brothers, was Wesley Fischel from Michigan State University. They had a contract, I think maybe before I got out there, with the ZM government to develop a police force independent of the Bensuian, for example, which was a good move, of course. But Fischel had ambitions also to take over not only that aspect of it, but a good many other things. And with the support of the State Department, I finally had to make clear to Michigan State that while we appreciated what Wesley Fischel was doing, it was my job to develop a broader program, all aspects of the economic assistance that we might give to Vietnam. And Fischel accepted that.
Fine. Cut for a minute, please, John. How important was aid from America to the survival of the ZM government in these early days?
I think it was crucial. certainly so far as the military aid was concerned, we had to develop an army that would really fight. We had a very able man, General Michael Daniel there, and I had no direct responsible for that. I delegated that to Mike, and he supervised the training. But this cost money. And so we did give the Vietnamese government military aid in order that they could, while they reduced the numbers of the standing army to 3 combat divisions, enough money was given to Michael Daniels so that he could begin the training of non-commissioned officers and Vietnamese officers. Because an important point was that the former French officers retained their command in many cases over the Diem forces, even though they were anti-Diem. They had dual citizenship. They retained citizenship as French officers and as Vietnamese. And this was one of the good things that Diem put a stop to. He said, you've got to either be Vietnamese or you're going to be French. And he made that part of it effective. So the military aid was an important financial assistance. But in addition to that, through MDAP, I can't even remember what those initials mean, but it was a military aid, rather the economic aid, which was administered by Leland Barrows, which supported the Diem government, particularly in aiding the farmers out in the field, trying to get Diem to parcel out the land which was owned by the absentee owners of the French and turning that over to the Vietnamese. He never really accomplished that. And this was one of his big failures with respect to the people in the countryside, the peasants. They had little or no results from the economic program. It was essential from the Vietnamese point of view because they had to keep up some export, and the only way they could export was their rubber. They had fine rubber and big rubber plantations, which later became the scene of vicious fighting later on. So they were dependent on us for both economic aid and for military aid, and it was substantial. I don't remember the figures, but it was substantial aid.
Could you describe the economic aid to the Diem government, particularly as it related to the refugees, and how important it was to them?
Well, I've already covered part of that. In addition to giving them economic aid, which assisted in the parceling out of land to the peasants and things of that ilk, the other aid that they needed was to settle the refugees, these 900,000 refugees from the north who came south. They had to build enclaves, which involved the construction of tents into which these people could live, other facilities. They set up little enclaves separate from the existing towns, for example, or villages. This cost money. And an important aspect or important assist that we gave to them in the settlement of the refugees was in this field. They did need some financial help in order to be able to do that. And it was, I think, an essential part of the overall aid which we gave to the Vietnamese.
Okay.
Just a moment. All right. General, you can begin counting. Now look at the book and begin counting. You have the book open. You have the book open and you're looking at it.
And count
to
to
yourself 5 slowly.
Aren't you glad the ordeal is over?
Oh, I don't mind it. It's always fascinating to me to...
Okay. Yeah, let's do it one more time. Just a moment, General. Right. Be looking at your book and begin counting to 5.
I bet you're glad this is over now and that we'll all go away. We'll pack up. And that'll be the end
Right.
of it.
Oh, you've been very kind and very cooperative and very constructive.
All right, Jennifer, if you begin looking at your book and count to 5. You didn't count to 5. You didn't
Oh,
count to 5.
too soon, huh?
Just a little bit too soon.
All right. You start again.
Count to 5 and then close the book slowly.
You received instructions from Eisenhower and Dulles before you went out to South Vietnam. I know that they briefed you extensively before your departure. Could you tell us a little about what they said about South Vietnam and what was important about the American presence there?
Didn't say too much about that.
You know,